To understand the man who would one day tame the lightning, one must first understand the darkness. Before the kite, before the bifocals, and long before the halls of Versailles, Benjamin Franklin was simply a shadow moving through the dim, tallow-lit streets of colonial Boston. His story does not begin with the flash of electricity, but with the heavy, cloying scent of rendered animal fat and the flickering light of a single handmade candle. The year was 1706, a time when the night was a formidable enemy, pushed back only by fire. In a small house on Milk Street, directly across from the Old South Meeting House, Benjamin was born into a world of teeming scarcity. He was the 15th of 17 children, a staggering number even for the hearty stock of New England Puritans, but his birth order carried a peculiar weight. He was his father's 10th son. In the deep, biblical traditions of his family, the 10th portion of anything, the harvest, the flock, or the coin belonged to the Lord. It was the tithe. His father, Josiah Franklin, was a pious man, a dyer of silk who had fled England to escape religious persecution, only to find himself boiling soap and dipping candles in the raw, wooden town of Boston to feed his massive brood. Josiah looked upon Benjamin, his 10th son, and saw a living offering. He decided that this boy, the tithe of his loins, would be dedicated to the church. Benjamin was to be a minister, a scholar of the divine, a voice echoing from the pulpit. For a brief, shining moment, the path seemed clear. At the age of 8, Benjamin was sent to the Boston Latin School. He drank in knowledge as dry earth drinks rain. He rose to the top of his class within months, displaying a terrifyingly sharp intelligence that seemed to hum with potential. He devoured grammar and logic, his mind expanding into the vacuum of ignorance that surrounded him. But the dream of the pulpit was fragile, built on the shifting sands of his father's poverty. The schooling lasted only 2 years. The cost of education was a luxury the soap boiler could not sustain, and the realization dawned on Josiah that a minister needed years of university training, something he could never afford. And so the tithe was rescinded. The church doors closed, and the factory doors opened. At 10 years old, Benjamin was pulled from his books and placed into the suffocating reality of the family trade. The world shrank from the infinite possibilities of the mind to the claustrophobic walls of the blue ball, the sign that hung over his father's shop. For 2 years, Benjamin lived in a sensory purgatory. The air was thick with the smell of boiling tallow, the rendered fat of sheep and cattle used to make cheap candles. It was a greasy, pervasive odor that clung to his hair, his skin, and his clothes. His days were spent in monotonous repetition, cutting wicks, filling dipping molds, attending the shop, and running errands. He loathed it. Every fibre of his being rebelled against the grease and the gore. He looked toward the grey waters of the Boston harbour with a desperate longing, watching the ships vanish over the horizon. He imagined himself a sailor, floating away from the smell of soap, away from the crowded house, away from the father who had offered him to God and then taken him back to boil fat. He swam in the cold harbour waters with a strength and grace that surprised observers, once even fashioning wooden paddles for his hands' primitive swim fins to pull himself faster through the current. He was trying, in his own way, to outswim his destiny. Sensing the boy's restlessness and fearing he would run away to sea, Josiah sought a different anchor. If not the church, and if not the candle shop, perhaps the world of words would hold him. At the age of 12, Benjamin was bound by law as an apprentice to his older brother James. James was a printer, a man of ink and iron, who had just returned from London with a press and a set of type. Benjamin signed the indenture papers, a legal contract that stripped him of his freedom until the age of 21. He was now the property of his brother, bound to serve, to learn, and to obey. But while the contract was a cage, the print shop was a revelation. The heavy metallic scent of the print shop was sweeter to Benjamin than any perfume. Here the labour was just as hard heaving the heavy lead forms, working the screw press until his muscles burned. But the product was not light for the eyes, but light for the mind. He was surrounded by words. Books, pamphlets, and broadsheets flowed through his hands. He became a creature of the night, borrowing books from friends and reading them by the light of the very candles he once despised making. He barely slept. He read Plutarch, he read Defoe, he read Bunyan, he absorbed the rhythm of language, dissecting sentences to understand how they were built, then reconstructing them to see if he could improve the flow. He realized early on that he was the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations, a genealogical curiosity that he felt destined him to be a nobody unless he carved his own statue from the rough stone of his life. He had no inheritance, no land, and no title. He had only his mind and the printing press. But the press belonged to James, and James was a harsh master. He was jealous of Benjamin's precocious talent, quick to anger and liberal with his fists. The relationship was fraught with the tension of 2 brothers who were too much alike in ambition, but separated by the vast chasm of power. James founded the New England Courant, one of the first independent newspapers in the colonies. It was a bold, scrappy publication that poked fun at the Boston elite and the rigid Puritan clergy. Benjamin wanted to write for it, to see his own thoughts stamped in ink, but James refused. He saw Benjamin only as a boy, a tool to set the type, not a voice to be heard. So Benjamin invented a voice. Under the cover of darkness he wrote a letter. He did not write as a 16-year-old boy, but adopted the persona of a middle-aged widow named Silence Dogood. She was pious, sharp-tongued, and fiercely observant of colonial follies. He slipped the letter under the door of his brother's shop at night, terrified and thrilled. The next day he watched from the shadows as James and his friends discovered the letter. They laughed, they praised the wit, and they speculated on who this learned widow might be, guessing at the most prominent men in Boston. They printed it on the front page. Benjamin stood at the press, setting the type for his own words, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had tricked them all. Over the next few months he wrote 14 letters as Silence Dogood, skewering the hypocrisies of the town. It was his first taste of power, the power to influence minds from behind a mask. When he finally confessed to being the author, the revelation did not bring the praise he hoped for. It brought resentment. James felt humiliated that his apprentice, his little brother, had outwitted him. The beatings increased. The atmosphere in the shop became toxic. Benjamin, now 17, realized that the indenture was not just a job, it was a prison that was slowly crushing his spirit. He made a decision that would mark the true beginning of his life. He decided to run. In 1723, breaking an indenture was a crime. Fugitive apprentices were hunted down, advertised in newspapers, and dragged back in chains. But the fire in Benjamin's mind could no longer be contained by the cold damp of Boston. He sold his few precious books to raise a small amount of cash, a sacrifice that felt like cutting off a limb. He conspired with a friend to smuggle himself aboard a sloop bound for New York, leaving behind his family, his city, and the heavy expectations of his father. He vanished into the sea mist, a fugitive with barely a penny to his name. The journey was a gauntlet. He arrived in New York, a stranger in a strange city, only to find no work for a printer. The old William Bradford, the city's only printer, told him of a vacancy in Philadelphia, 100 miles further south. Benjamin, undeterred, pressed on. The voyage to Perth Amboy was treacherous. A squall tore the rotten sails of his small boat, and a drunken Dutchman fell overboard, nearly drowning them all. They spent 30 hours battling the wind and the waves without food or water, finally dragging themselves onto the shore of New Jersey, soaked and shivering. Benjamin walked. He walked across the colony of New Jersey, 50 miles on foot, through rain and mud. He was delirious with fever for a time, suspecting he had pleurisy, but he drank cold water in vast quantities until the sweat broke the fever. He was a scarecrow of a young man, dishevelled, his pockets stuffed with shirts and stockings, his appearance wild and desperate. People looked at him with suspicion, taking him for a runaway servant, which, in truth, he was. Finally, he reached the Delaware River and found a boat to Philadelphia. They arrived on a Sunday morning in October 1723. The Philadelphia he stepped into was not the paved and ordered city of his later years. It was a growing, bustling Quaker town, but to Benjamin it was the promised land. He stepped onto the Market Street wharf, cold, dirty, and ravenous. He had $1 and about a shilling in copper coins remaining in his pocket. He was 17 years old, completely alone, and unknown to a single soul in the city. His first act was to find food. He wandered up the street, gazing at the unfamiliar brick houses and the people in their plain Quaker dress. He found a bakery and asked for a biscuit, the kind he was used to in Boston. The baker shook his head. They didn't make them there. Benjamin asked for a 3-penny loaf. The baker told him they didn't have those either. Frustrated and starving, Benjamin handed the man 3 pennies and asked for whatever bread that amount would buy. The baker handed him 3 enormous puffy rolls. Benjamin was startled by the quantity. Bread was cheaper and more plentiful here than in Boston. With no bag to carry them, he tucked one roll under his left arm, the other under his right, and walked down Market Street eating the third. It was a ridiculous sight. A bedraggled, fugitive teenager, pockets bulging with dirty laundry, clutching bread like a lifeline. As he walked, he passed the doorway of a Mr. Red. Standing on the step was a young girl named Deborah. She watched him pass this awkward, ridiculous boy stuffing his face with bread, and thought he made a most odd and sorry figure. She had no way of knowing that she was looking at her future husband, or that this boy, eating his roll with the desperate hunger of a survivor, would one day be the most famous man in the world. He walked all the way to the river, drank a ladle of water, and gave his 2 extra rolls to a woman and her child who had come down the river on the boat with him. It was a gesture of characteristic generosity, even in his scarcity. He then followed a group of well-dressed people into the great meeting house of the Quakers. He sat down on a bench, the silence of the meeting wrapping around him like a blanket. The exhaustion of the journey, the terror of the escape, and the fullness of the bread finally overtook him. There, in the quiet sanctuary of strangers, Benjamin Franklin fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. It was the first rest of his new life. When he woke, the uncertainty of his position remained, but the fear had been replaced by a quiet resolve. He found work with a printer named Samuel Keymer, a bearded, eccentric man who knew little of the trade. Benjamin's superior training from Boston quickly made him indispensable. He was faster, smarter, and more inventive than anyone Keymer had ever seen. He could fix the press when it broke, he could cast molds for type, he could make the ink, but even as he worked his hands in the ink, his mind was already plotting a course far beyond the print shop. He had tasted freedom, and he found it intoxicated him more than wine. He began to cultivate a circle of friends, like-minded young men who loved books and debate. He was charming, funny, and possessed a physical strength that commanded respect. He was no longer the tithe offered to the church, nor the tallow candler's son destined for the vat. He was a citizen of his own making, yet the shadow of his youth, the lessons of the scarcity he left behind, remained etched in his psyche. He had learned that nothing in this world was given. The 10th son received no inheritance. If he wanted wisdom, he had to steal hours from the night to read. If he wanted freedom, he had to run for it. If he wanted bread, he had to walk 50 miles through the rain to buy it. This deep-seated knowledge that he was the architect of his own existence began to form the foundation of a philosophy that would define him. He looked at the chaotic, disorganized world around him and saw a machine that could be improved. Just as he had fixed his brother's sentences, he began to look at his own life as a manuscript to be edited. He saw his own flaws not as sins to be punished, but as errors to be corrected. In those early days in Philadelphia, walking the streets with the ink stains on his fingers, a grand experiment began to take shape in his mind. It was not an experiment with wires or kites, but with the human soul. He wondered if it was possible to arrive at moral perfection through the same rigorous application of logic he used to set type. He was young, he was brilliant, and he was possessed of a vanity he would spend a lifetime trying to humble. The city of brotherly love lay before him, a blank page waiting for his imprint, and as the winter of 1724 approached, the young printer prepared to set the type for his next chapter, unaware that the path would soon lead him across the ocean to the heart of the empire and into the very centre of the Enlightenment. But before the ocean could claim him, and before the grand theatres of London would test his resolve, there remained the lingering shadow of the boy he had been in Boston, and the voice he had discovered not in his own throat, but in the guise of a ghost. To understand the man who stood ready to conquer the world with nothing but his wits, one must look back to the cramped, ink-stained workshop of his brother James, where the seeds of his genius were first sown in the fertile soil of resentment and ambition. He was the 10th son of a soap boiler, a boy born into a crowded house where attention was a scarce commodity and inheritance was a dream for others. There was no land waiting for him, no title to descend upon his shoulders. He was the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations, a lineage of makers and tradesmen, and he understood early that if he were to be anything at all, he would have to construct himself from scratch, much like a book bound from loose sheets of paper, in the suffocating atmosphere of his brother's printing shop, where he was bound by the heavy chains of indenture. The young Benjamin found his escape not in physical flight, at least, not yet, but in the liberation of the mind. He watched his brother publish the works of others, feeling the sharp sting of his own silenced voice. He knew he was a better writer than the men who frequented the shop, yet he was merely the apprentice, the invisible hand that set the type, but was forbidden to compose the words. And so, under the cover of the Boston night, while the city slept under a blanket of sea mist, he invented a mask. He did not write as a rebellious boy, for a boy would be ignored. Instead, he dipped his quill into the persona of a middle-aged widow, a woman of sharp wit and rustic wisdom, whom he named Silence Dogood. It was a masterstroke of psychological intuition. Who would suspect the 17-year-old apprentice, with his unruly hair and ink-blackened fingers, of being the voice behind the weary, cynical, yet hilarious observations of a lonely woman? He would slide these letters under the door of his brother's shop in the dead of night, his heart pounding with the thrill of the deception. The next day he would stand silently by the press, his face a mask of indifference, while his brother and his friends praised the mysterious widow's eloquence, laughing at her jokes, and marvelling at her insight. It was his first taste of a power he would wield for the rest of his life, the power of the anonymous observer, the puppeteer who moves the strings while standing in the shadows. He learned that the message is often better received when the messenger is obscured, a lesson that would serve him well in the courts of kings and the halls of Congress. But the mask could not hold forever, and when the truth was revealed, the friction with his brother became unbearable. The 10th son was not made to serve, he was made to ascend, and so came the flight to Philadelphia, the arrival with the 3-penny rolls, and the beginning of the ascent. Yet the ghost of Silence Dogood remained with him. She was the proof that he could be anyone he chose to be. He could be a widow, a scholar, a scientist, or a statesman. The world was a stage, and he was crafting the ultimate role. This theatrical ability to adapt was essential when, at the tender age of 18, he found himself stranded in London. He had crossed the Atlantic on the promise of financial backing from the governor of Pennsylvania, only to arrive in the sprawling, fog-choked capital of the empire, and discover the promises were empty. He was alone, thousands of miles from home, in a city that devoured the weak. But Benjamin was not weak. He viewed this not as a disaster, but as a graduate education in the school of life. He found work in the great printing houses of London, navigating the labyrinth of cobblestone streets and the smoky taverns where the pressmen gathered. Here, amidst the clinking of tankards and the haze of tobacco smoke, he stood apart. His colleagues drank 6 pints of strong beer a day, believing it gave them strength. Franklin drank only water. They mocked him, calling him the Water American. But they could not deny that he was stronger than them. He could carry 2 heavy forms of lead type, one in each hand, up and down the stairs, while they struggled with one. His mind remained clear while theirs grew fogs. He was conducting an experiment on his own physiology, proving that energy came from bread and rest, not from the heavy stupor of alcohol. London opened his eyes to the vastness of the Enlightenment. He swam in the Thames, showing off the aquatic prowess he had developed as a boy when he invented wooden paddles for his hands to cut through the Boston Harbor waters. He engaged in coffeehouse debates, his mind absorbing the radical ideas of Europe like a sponge. But he did not lose himself in the drift. The chaos of London, with its poverty and its grandeur, taught him the value of order. He saw the waste of potential in the lives around him, and he resolved to return to America not just as a printer, but as a philosopher of the practical. Upon his return to Philadelphia, the Water American began the most ambitious project of his life. He was now a man of business, but his soul craved a structure that commerce alone could not provide. He looked at his own character and saw it as a rough draft, full of errata typos of the soul that needed correction. He did not turn to prayer in the traditional sense. He turned to a ledger. He created a little book, and on each page he ruled columns for the days of the week, and rows for 13 virtues he wished to acquire: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and finally, humility. This last virtue was added only after a Quaker friend kindly informed him that he was generally considered proud and overbearing. Franklin, taking the criticism as data rather than an insult, added the maxim, "Imitate Jesus and Socrates." He tracked his behavior with the obsession of an accountant. Every time he failed a virtue, he marked a black dot in his book. He wanted to see a clean page, a week without spots, a soul without error. He found that order was the hardest to keep. His mind was too active, his interests too varied to keep every paper and object in its exact place. He struggled, he failed, and the black dots accumulated. But in this struggle, he found a profound truth. The attempt was more important than the perfection. He compared himself to a man who buys a speckled axe and asks the smith to grind it bright. The smith agrees, but only if the man turns the grindstone. The man turns and turns until he is exhausted and finally says, "I think I like a speckled axe best." Franklin realized that a perfect character might be insufferable to others, invoking envy and hatred. A benevolent man, he reasoned, should perhaps allow a few faults in himself to keep his friends in countenance. It was a rationalization, perhaps, but it allowed him to accept his humanity while still striving to elevate it. This pragmatic approach to life extended to his physical habits as well. He was a man who lived in his body as much as his mind. In a time when bathing was considered suspect and fresh air was feared as a carrier of disease, Franklin developed the air bath. Every morning he would rise early, strip himself entirely naked, and sit in his room for half an hour or an hour reading or writing. He sat there in the quiet solitude, letting the cool air wash over his skin, believing it hardened the constitution and cleared the pores. Imagine the scene. The most famous man in the colonies, the future diplomat and scientist, sitting stark naked in the pale light of dawn, the window open to the Philadelphia breeze, calmly penning letters or drafting essays while the rest of the city huddled under heavy woolens. It was a private ritual of liberation, a daily return to a natural state before the wig and the velvet coat were donned to face society. It was in these quiet, cold moments that his mind was free to roam, to connect the unconnected, to see the invisible currents that ran through the world. He understood people as well as he understood the mechanics of a printing press. He knew that human beings were driven by pride and self-interest, and rather than fight this, he used it. He developed what would later be known as the Ben Franklin effect. When he faced a rival in the legislature who opposed him, he did not attack the man. Instead, he sent him a note, asking to borrow a rare and curious book from the man's library. The rival, flattered by the request and the acknowledgement of his taste, sent the book. When Franklin returned it with a warm note of thanks, the man's hostility evaporated. Franklin had hacked the social code. He that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged. He turned an enemy into a friend, not by doing a favour, but by asking for one. As the years passed, the industrious printer transformed into a civic leader. He was no longer the runaway apprentice or the water American. He was a man of substance. He retired from active business at the age of 42, a wealthy man, not to rest, but to have the leisure to study. He had conquered poverty. Now he wished to conquer ignorance. But even as he ascended, there were cracks in the foundation. The relationship with his son, William, whom he had fathered out of wedlock and raised as his legitimate heir, was a complex knot of love and expectation. William was the son of the great man, living in the long shadow cast by his father's fame. They were partners in everything, even in the early electrical experiments where William helped him fly the famous kite. But beneath the surface, a tectonic shift was occurring, a divergence of loyalty that would eventually tear them apart as violently as the coming revolution would tear the colonies from the mother country. For now, however, in the quiet study of his retirement, surrounded by his books and his machines, Benjamin Franklin looked out at a world that was ripe for understanding. He saw lightning in the sky and wondered if it could be trapped. He saw the colonies growing and wondered if they could be united. He saw the suffering of the sick and invented a flexible catheter to ease his brother's pain. He saw the inefficiency of the stove and invented a better one. He was a polymath, a man who refused to specialize because the universe itself did not specialize. The ink was dry on the pages of his youth. The widow Silence Dogood had long since retired to the archives of his memory. The water American had become the sage of Philadelphia. And as the century pivoted toward its chaotic second half, the man who had sought moral perfection through a ledger was about to find himself pulled into a storm far greater than any he had watched from his window during an air bath. The clouds were gathering over the Atlantic, charged with a different kind of electricity, the static charge of rebellion. And Benjamin Franklin, the man who knew how to ground the lightning, would soon find himself holding the wire. The candle flickered on his desk, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of his study. Shadows that seemed to whisper of empires falling and new nations rising. He dipped his quill, not into the satire of a widow, but into the serious ink of history, ready to write the next passage of an age that would bear his signature. The Fugitive and the River. To understand the hand that would one day tame the lightning, one must first trace the currents of the water that carried him away from the life he was born to endure. Before he was a sage, before he was a diplomat standing in the gilded halls of Versailles, he was simply a boy standing on the edge of a harbour, looking out at the grey expanse of the Atlantic, feeling the pull of the tide in his very bones. He was the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations, a lineage that promised no inheritance, no land, and no title. In the crowded house on Milk Street in Boston, amidst the smells of tallow and boiling soap from his father's trade, Benjamin Franklin learned early that if he wished to rise, he would have to construct a ladder of his own making. The first rungs of that ladder were carved from rebellion. At 12 years old, he had been bound by law and ink to his brother James, a printer who wielded his authority with a heavy, jealous hand. The printing shop was a place of clattering type and the sharp scent of oil, a world where ideas were pressed onto paper, but where Benjamin himself was expected to remain silent. But the mind of the apprentice was a restless engine. When the daylight faded and the shop fell quiet, he would retreat into the fortress of his books, consuming the world by the light of a stone and candle. He taught himself the rhythms of the spectator and the logic of the philosophers, sharpening a wit that would soon cut through the dull fabric of Bostonian society. It was here, in the shadow of his brother's tyranny, that he first discovered the power of a mask. Under the cover of night, he slipped his own words under the door of the print shop, writing not as a teenage boy, but as Silence Dogood, a middle-aged widow with a sharp tongue and a dislike for arbitrary power. The town was captivated. They laughed and debated the widow's words, never suspecting that the author was the ink-stained boy sweeping the floor. But when the truth was revealed, The pride of the apprentice collided with the envy of the master. The beatings from James grew frequent, the atmosphere in the shop suffocating. The contract of indenture, which was supposed to bind him until the age of 21, felt less like an apprenticeship and more like a prison sentence. And so, at the age of 17, Benjamin Franklin made the choice that would define the rest of his existence. He chose to become a fugitive. To break an indenture was a crime, a mark of dishonor that could see a man hunted down and returned in chains. But the call of the horizon was louder than the warning of the law. He sold his few precious books to purchase a passage, severing the tether to his family, his city, and his past. He boarded a sloop under the cover of a lie, telling the captain he had gotten a girl with child and needed to flee her angry kin, a fabrication that allowed him to slip away into the anonymity of the sea. The journey was not a gentle escape, it was a baptism. The winds howled against them as they sailed for New York, the canvas snapping like pistol shots in the gale. The boy who would one day study the physics of storms now found himself at the mercy of one, huddled in the damp hold, watching the lantern swing violently with the pitch of the waves. When he finally stepped onto the cobblestones of New York, he was a stranger in a strange land, with little money and no prospects. The great city offered him no work, only a pointed finger directed further south, toward a growing town called Philadelphia. Whatever romance he might have imagined in the life of a wanderer was quickly washed away by the rain that battered him as he crossed New Jersey. He walked for 50 miles, a solitary figure trudging through the mud, his clothes soaked and his pockets light. At night he slept in feverish exhaustion, his body aching from the miles, suspecting that he had made a terrible mistake. He was a fugitive, alone, drifting between the life he had destroyed and a future he could not yet see. But it was the river that saved him. He found a boat to take him down the Delaware, a small craft that required him to take the oars alongside the boatman. The night was dark, the river a black ribbon winding through the silent forests. They rowed until their arms burned, the rhythmic dip and pull of the oars becoming a meditative trance. When midnight passed and the fatigue became too great, they pulled into a small creek, not knowing where they were. They made a fire from the driftwood of an old fence, shivering in the damp cold of October, waiting for the light. In that quiet darkness, huddled by the fire on the banks of the Delaware, the boy was being forged into the man. He was learning the essential lesson of the frontier, that survival depended not on who your father was or what station you were born into, but on the strength of your back and the resilience of your mind. When the sun rose, it revealed the city of Philadelphia just ahead. It was Sunday morning, the air was crisp, and the streets were quiet as Benjamin Franklin stepped off the boat at the Market Street wharf. He was a dishevelled sight, his pockets stuffed with shirts and stockings, his coat dusty and wrinkled, his face unshaven and pale from the journey. He had $1 and a shilling in copper coin to his name. Hunger gnawed at him, a visceral reminder of his precarious state. He found a baker and asked for 3 pennies worth of bread, expecting the small flat loaves of Boston. Instead, the baker handed him 3 great puffy rolls, far larger than he could carry in his hands. With no bag to hold them, he tucked one roll under each arm and walked down the street eating the third, a spectacle of awkward improvisation. He walked up Market Street, a procession of one, passing the neatly dressed families heading to the meeting house. Among them stood a young woman named Deborah Red, standing in the doorway of her father's house. She watched this strange, ragged boy lumbering past with his bread, suppressing a laugh at his ridiculous appearance. She could not know, nor could he, that she was looking at her future husband, or that the boy with the rolls would one day be the most famous man in the world. He wandered aimlessly until the flow of the crowd carried him into the great meeting house of the Quakers. He sat down on a bench, surrounded by the deep, contemplative silence of the congregation. The exhaustion of the escape, the storm, the walking and the rowing finally overtook him. In the quiet sanctity of that hall, amidst the silent prayers of strangers, the fugitive closed his eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. It was the first true rest he had known since leaving Boston, a peaceful interlude before the labor of his life began. But the river of his journey did not stop at the banks of the Delaware. The current of ambition, once unleashed, pulls a man toward the sea. Franklin found work in Philadelphia, his skills as a printer quickly setting him apart, but his youth made him vulnerable to the whims of powerful men. Governor Keith, a man of lavish promises and empty pockets, convinced the young printer to travel to London to purchase equipment for a shop of his own, promising to send letters of credit to fund the venture. Trusting in the word of a gentleman, Franklin boarded yet another ship, crossing the vast Atlantic to the heart of the empire. But when the ship docked in London, the letters were nowhere to be found. The governor had lied. But 18 years old, Benjamin Franklin was stranded in the largest city in the world, thousands of miles from home, with no money and no friends. It was a disaster that would have broken a lesser spirit. For Franklin, it became a university. London was a chaotic, thriving intellectual hive, and he threw himself into it with the same voracious appetite he had for books. He worked in the great printing houses, his hands stained with the ink of the Enlightenment. He realized then that the world did not care for his plans, and that reliance on the patronage of others was a fool's errand. If he was to succeed, it would be through his own industry, his own frugality, and his own sheer will. He became known among the printers of London as the Water American. While the English workmen drank gallons of beer throughout the day to sustain their strength, becoming sluggish and dull, Franklin drank only water. He was stronger than them, faster than them, and clearer of mind. He swam in the Thames, a feat that amazed the Londoners who rarely entered the water, once swimming from Chelsea to Blackfriars, performing aquatic tricks and showing off the strength he had built in the harbours of Boston. He even considered for a brief moment becoming a swimming instructor and remaining in Europe forever, a life of leisure and physical grace. But the pull of Philadelphia was too strong. The memory of the quiet Quaker meeting house, the potential of the growing colonies, and the unfinished business of his own life called him back. He returned to the sea, enduring the long voyage home, but this time he was not a fugitive running away. He was a man returning with a purpose. On that voyage, staring into the endless blue of the ocean, he took out a notebook and began to write. He did not write poetry, nor did he write complaints. He wrote a plan. He drafted a set of rules for his own conduct, a scaffolding for his character. He resolved to speak only what was useful, to waste nothing, to lose no time, and to avoid the deceitful promises that had stranded him in London. He realized that since he had no title to inherit, he would have to invent himself, piece by piece, virtue by virtue, just as he would set type in a galley letter by letter, line by line, until the page was full and legible. When he stepped back onto the wharf in Philadelphia, the boy who had arrived with rolls under his arms was gone. In his place stood a man who viewed his life as a ledger to be balanced. He was 20 years old. He had no fortune, but he possessed a terrifying capacity for work and a mind that saw the invisible connections between things. The city lay before him, a blank page waiting for his impress. He secured a job. He gathered a group of like-minded tradesmen called the Junto to debate and improve themselves, and he began to climb. He worked late into the night, the light of his shop spilling out onto the darkened street long after his competitors had gone to the taverns. The neighbours noticed. They saw the young Franklin carting his own paper through the streets in a wheelbarrow, wearing his leather apron, signalling to the world that he was not too proud to labour. He was constructing the foundation of a reputation, brick by brick. But even as he built his business, the water continued to flow through his mind. He remembered the swim fins he had invented as a child, wooden paddles for his hands that allowed him to cut through the currents with superhuman speed. He remembered the feeling of the kite string in his hand when he was a boy, floating on his back in a pond, letting the wind pull him across the water without effort. He saw the world not as a static painting, but as a series of forces: wind, water, heat, and time that could be understood, harnessed, and directed. The fugitive had found his home, and the river had taught him its lesson that the only way to survive the current is to become the master of the vessel. As the years of his early manhood settled into a rhythm of ink and industry, a new curiosity began to take hold. It started with the simple observation of weather, of the way storms moved against the wind, of the mysterious fire that danced in the clouds. The Water American was about to turn his eyes toward the fire in the sky, and the world would never be the same again. The ink was wet, the press was ready, and the almanac of his life was opening to its most vibrant chapter. But before he could fully grasp the lightning, he had to navigate the fog. The path to wisdom was rarely a straight line, and for Benjamin it required a journey across the Atlantic, away from the familiar currents of the Delaware River and into the dense, coal-smoked heart of the British Empire. He was 18 years old, a boy with the mind of a philosopher, standing on the deck of a ship bound for London. He believed he was travelling under the patronage of a governor, promised letters of credit and financial backing to purchase equipment for his own printing shop. But as the white sails caught the wind and the American coast dissolved into the horizon, Benjamin was sailing into a lesson on the fragility of promises. When he arrived in London, the letters of credit were nowhere to be found. The governor's assurances had been nothing more than polite fiction, a whim of the aristocracy that left a teenager stranded in the world's largest metropolis without a patron or a penny to his name. London in the 1720s was a labyrinth of brick and cobblestone, a sensory overload of shouting hawkers, clattering carriages, and the perpetual biting scent of coal smoke that hung low over the Thames. It was a place where a young man could easily vanish, swallowed by the sheer scale of humanity. But Benjamin did not vanish. Instead, he treated this misfortune as he treated everything else, as a raw material to be worked, shaped, and improved. He found work at the famous printing house of Palmer's, and later at Watts's near Lincoln's Inn Fields. The printing floor became his university. The air was thick with the smell of lampblack and oil, the rhythmic clack and thud of the presses acting as the heartbeat of the Enlightenment. Here, among the journeymen of London, Benjamin stood apart. The English printers were men of habit, consuming roughly 5 pints of strong beer throughout the workday, believing the heavy liquid gave them the strength to haul the lead-tight forms. They watched with bewildered amusement as the young American, whom they dubbed the Water American, drank only water, yet carried 2 heavy trays of type up and down the stairs with an ease that left the beer drinkers breathless. He was proving, through the quiet demonstration of his own body, that clarity was a stronger fuel than fermentation. This period was his crucible of independence. He lived simply, spending his meagre earnings on books and plays, immersing himself in the intellectual currents of Europe. He frequented the coffee houses where men in powdered wigs debated philosophy and governance, listening more than he spoke, observing the social machinery of the empire. He saw the brilliance of London, but he also saw its decay, the rigid class structures, the poverty hidden in the shadows of cathedrals, the arrogance of hereditary power. When he eventually secured passage back to Philadelphia, he was no longer just a printer's apprentice running from a harsh brother. He was a man of the world, returning with a mind sharpened by the stone of adversity. Back in Philadelphia, the rhythm of his life accelerated, yet he maintained a secret, silent stillness at its core. He understood that to master the external world, one must first master the internal one. As his printing business grew, bringing him wealth and influence, he cultivated private rituals to anchor his restless intellect. In the quiet solitude of the early morning, long before the city awoke, Benjamin would rise to perform what he called his air bath. He would sit entirely naked in his chamber, the windows thrown open to the cool, crisp air of the dawn. He believed the skin needed to breathe, that the cold air was a tonic that invigorated the constitution. There, in the pale light, sitting in his chair with a book or a pen, he was simply a man, in his natural state, communing with the elements, stripping away the pretensions of society before the day required him to dress in the costume of a gentleman. It was in these quiet hours that he engaged in his bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. He crafted a small book, a ledger of the soul, in which he listed 13 virtues: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. Each day he would mark his transgressions with a black dot, treating his character like a proof sheet coming off the press, looking for typos and errors to correct in the next edition. He found that order was the hardest to keep, and humility was a constant struggle for a man who knew he was often the smartest person in the room. When a friend gently pointed out that Benjamin was generally considered proud and overbearing, he added humility to the list with the simple maxim, imitate Jesus and Socrates. He learned that the appearance of humility was as useful as the virtue itself, finding that when he spoke with diffidence, softening his arguments with phrases like, "It appears to me," or "I imagine it to be so," he could persuade men far more effectively than with dogmatic assertions. This understanding of human nature became his most potent tool. He realized that people did not like to be indebted, but they loved to be the benefactor. He famously turned a rival legislator into a lifelong friend, not by doing him a favor, but by asking one of him. Benjamin sent a note asking to borrow a rare and curious book from the man's library. Flattered by the request and the acknowledgement of his taste, the rival sent the book immediately. When they next met, the man spoke to Benjamin with great civility. Benjamin noted the truth that would echo through psychology centuries later. He that has once done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another than he whom you yourself have obliged. By the age of 42, Benjamin had done the unthinkable for a man of his time. He retired. He had built a franchise of print shops, created the beloved Poor Richard's Almanac, and secured enough wealth to step away from the daily grind of commerce. But this was not a retirement into idleness. It was a liberation of his time, purchasing the leisure to study. He turned his printing house over to a partner, and turned his face fully toward the mysteries of the natural world. It was now that the water American began to play with fire. The study of electricity became his obsession. In his quiet house, away from the bustle of Market Street, he filled rooms with glass tubes, Leyden jars, and rotating spheres. He saw electricity not as a parlor trick, which was how it was treated in Europe, but as a fundamental fluid of nature, flowing between bodies, seeking equilibrium. He stood in the thunderstorms not in fear, but in awe, sensing the connection between the spark in his laboratory and the jagged bolts tearing the sky. When he finally proved it, drawing the electric fire down a wet kite string to a key in his hand, he felt the pulse of the universe in his knuckles. He had united the heavens and the earth, taming the lightning that had terrified humanity since the dawn of time. His mind moved effortlessly between the grand and the gentle. The same hands that held the kite string also dipped into a bowl of water to play the glass harmonica, an instrument of his own invention. He had seen musicians playing water-tuned wine glasses and was enchanted by the sound, but frustrated by the inefficiency. So he mounted a series of graduated glass bowls on a horizontal spindle, spun by a foot pedal. When he touched his wet fingers to the spinning glass, the sound that emerged was ethereal, a singing, ghostly vibration that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a sound so pure and melancholic that it brought tears to the eyes of listeners, a music that Mozart and Beethoven would later compose for. It was the sound of the spheres, the friction of the invisible made audible. But the tranquility of the laboratory and the music room could not shield him from the gathering storm of history. The colonies were growing restless, and the crown was tightening its grip. Franklin, now the most famous American in the world, was sent back to London, not as a boy printer, but as a diplomat, a representative of the colonies trying to bridge the widening chasm. For years he walked the tightrope, a loyal subject of the king who loved the empire, but loved the liberties of his people more. He believed in reason, in the power of conversation to solve conflict, but the London he returned to was not the place of open-minded enlightenment he had idealized in his youth. It was harder, colder, and deaf to the pleas of its children across the ocean. The turning point came in a room known as the Cockpit. It was January 1774, in a stuffy amphitheatre-like chamber near Whitehall. Benjamin stood before the Privy Council, the most powerful men in the British Empire. He was there to present a petition, but he had been summoned to be destroyed. He had leaked private letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, which revealed that the governor had encouraged the British government to crack down on colonial liberties. Franklin had sent the letters to Boston to show that the hostility was coming from a few corrupt officials, not the king himself, hoping to calm the tensions. The plan backfired spectacularly. The Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, unleashed a torrent of abuse that lasted for over an hour. He pounded the table, calling Franklin a thief, a conspirator, a man without honor, inciting the lords of the council to laughter and jeers. The room was hot, crowded, and thick with the scent of hostility. Through it all, Benjamin Franklin stood motionless. He stood near the fireplace, dressed in a suit of spotted Manchester velvet, his face a mask of stone. He did not speak. He did not defend himself against the insults. He simply stood, absorbing the venom, watching the faces of the men he had once admired, the men he had thought were his peers. In that hour of public humiliation, the water American, the loyal subject, the bridge builder, died. As the laughter of the Privy Council echoed off the high ceiling, something harder and colder formed in his heart. He realized that reason would not work here. He realized that to these men he would never be an equal. He would always be a colonial, a subordinate, a subject to be ruled. He walked out of the cockpit in silence. But the silence was not of submission. It was the calm before a terrible storm. He went back to his lodgings and took off the spotted velvet suit. He folded it carefully and placed it in his trunk. He would not wear it again for years. He made a silent vow that the next time he donned that specific coat, it would be to sign the death warrant of the empire that had just laughed at him. The scientist who had tamed the lightning was now ready to help unleash the thunder of revolution. The currents of his life, the ink, the water, the fire, and the wind, were all converging toward a single inevitable point. The Atlantic Ocean, which he had crossed so many times, was no longer a highway connecting one people. It was becoming a vast, unbridgeable divide. And on the far side of that water, a new idea was waiting to be printed, not in an almanac, but on the parchment of history. But the man who closed the trunk was not merely a reaction to British scorn. He was a construct, a deliberate creation of his own making, forged over decades of rigorous, almost obsessive self-examination. To understand the fury that now simmered beneath his calm exterior, one had to understand the sheer force of will it had taken to invent Benjamin Franklin in the first place. He was not born into greatness, nor was he heir to any dynasty. He was, as he often reminded himself in the quiet of the early morning, the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations. There was no inheritance waiting for him, no ancestral estate to cushion a fall. There was only the vast open possibility of the new world, and the raw material of his own mind. Decades before he stood in the cockpit, he had stood on a wharf in Philadelphia, a 17-year-old fugitive with nothing but the clothes on his back and a few coins in his pocket. He had fled the harsh apprenticeship of his brother in Boston, breaking the law to break free of mediocrity. He arrived in the city of brotherly love, not as a statesman, but as a vagrant, dishevelled and wet from the journey. He walked up Market Street, his pockets stuffed with shirts and stockings, holding a puffy roll of bread under each arm while eating a third. He was a spectacle of poverty, yet his eyes were scanning the brick facades and the cobblestones, not with envy, but with the hunger of a builder surveying a vacant lot. He saw a life that did not yet exist, and he resolved to build it, brick by brick, virtue by virtue. It was in those early quiet years, long before the fame, that he initiated what he called the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. He viewed his own character as he viewed a printing press, a machine that could be calibrated, oiled, and adjusted to produce a cleaner impression on the world. He did not trust in vague aspirations of goodness. Instead, he bought a small notebook. On each page, he ruled the lines with red ink, creating a grid for the 13 virtues he deemed essential for a life of worth: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. He treated his soul like a ledger. Every evening, by the light of a tallow candle, he would review his day. If he had spoken too much, he marked a black dot next to silence. if he had wasted time, a dot next to industry. It was a lonely, quiet battle, fought in the deep hours of the night when the rest of the city slept. He found that while he could master many of his impulses, the virtue of order remained elusive. His mind was a sprawling marketplace of ideas, always jumping from one curiosity to the next, leaving his desk a chaotic jumble of papers and instruments. He fretted over this failure until he recalled the story of a man who wanted a speckled axe because a fully polished one was too difficult to maintain and more prone to rust. Perhaps, he reasoned in the amber glow of his lamp, a benevolent man should have a few faults, lest he become insufferable to his friends. But the hardest virtue was the one he added last. A Quaker friend had gently informed him that he was generally considered proud, even arrogant, in his brilliance. Franklin, realizing that pride was the enemy of influence, added humility to his list, with the simple directive, imitate Jesus and Socrates. He learned to mask his certainty. He stopped using words like certainly and undoubtedly, replacing them with I conceive or I imagine. He discovered that by denying himself the immediate pleasure of being right, he gained the long-term power of persuasion. He learned that if you wish to win a man over, you do not argue with him, you ask him for a favor. He once turned a rival legislator into a lifelong friend simply by asking to borrow a rare book from his library. He understood that the human heart is a mechanism of reciprocity. He who has done you a kindness will be more ready to do you another. This relentless drive for improvement extended beyond the mind and into the very vessel of his body. He was a man of the Enlightenment, and he treated his physical form as another laboratory for experimentation. While the world bundled itself in heavy woolens against the damp, fearful of the night air, Franklin embraced the elements. He developed a ritual that he practiced religiously, often to the bafflement of his neighbors. In the early morning, before the sun had fully risen and the streets were still grey with mist, he would rise and strip himself entirely naked. He would sit in his chamber with the windows thrown wide open, allowing the cold air to wash over his skin for half an hour or more. He called this his air bath. He sat there a nude, middle-aged philosopher, reading or writing letters while the cool breeze invigorated his pores. He believed the skin needed to breathe, that the stuffy confines of modern clothing were a cage that bred disease. In those silent, shivering moments, he felt a clarity that the heat of the day could not provide. He was connecting with the atmosphere, the same invisible ocean of air that carried the lightning he would later tame. It was a private eccentricity, a communion with nature in its rawest form, centered on the belief that the body, like the mind, flourished best when exposed to the open currents of the world. His curiosity was a physical sensation, an itch that could only be scratched by invention. He looked at the world and saw not what it was, but what it could be if only someone bothered to fix it. As a boy, he had felt the water dragging against his hands while swimming. So he crafted wooden pallets, precursors to swim fins, to strap onto his palms, turning himself into an aquatic creature that cut through the currents with ease. As an old man, watching his brother suffer the agonies of kidney stones, he did not merely offer sympathy. He went to his workbench and designed a flexible urinary catheter made of hinged silver, smoothing the rough edges of human suffering with the application of ingenious design. His mind was attuned to the vibrations of the universe, quite literally. He was entranced by the sound of wet fingers rubbing the rim of a wine glass, that ethereal singing tone that seemed to come from nowhere. But he was not content to merely listen. He had to organize the sound. He commissioned a series of glass bowls, blown to specific sizes and tunings, and mounted them on a horizontal spindle that could be spun by a foot pedal. He nested them inside one another, a spinning kaleidoscope of crystal. When he touched his wet fingers to the rotating glass, the sound that emerged was unlike anything heard on earth, a high, piercing, melancholic hum that seemed to resonate directly in the bones. He called it the glass harmonica. The music was so haunting, so otherworldly, that some listeners claimed it disturbed their nerves or woke the spirits of the dead. Mozart and Beethoven would write for it. But for Franklin, it was simply another manifestation of order brought to chaos, a way to make the invisible visible, or in this case, audible. Yet, for all his mastery over glass and ink and lightning, there was one variable he could not control. One element of his life that defied his project of perfection, his own blood. The tragedy of Benjamin Franklin was that the very independence he cultivated in himself, he also cultivated in his son William. William Franklin was his illegitimate son, a boy born of a secret indiscretion, who Benjamin had taken in and raised with a fierce, protective love. They had been partners in everything. When Benjamin flew the kite into the storm to catch the electricity of the heavens, it was William standing beside him in the shed, holding the string, sharing the danger and the discovery. Benjamin had used his immense influence to secure William the position of Royal Governor of New Jersey, the proudest achievement of a father wanting the best for his child. He had smoothed the path that had been so rough for himself. But as the political sky darkened, as the rift between London and the colonies widened, the father and son found themselves on opposite sides of a canyon that no bridge could span. Benjamin, the self-made man, believed in the power of the people to govern themselves. William, the man born into the establishment his father had built, believed in order, in hierarchy, in the crown. The virtues Benjamin had taught him, resolution, loyalty, duty, William now turned against his father's cause. The pain of this was a dull, constant ache beneath Franklin's ribs, sharper than any gout or stone. He had spent a lifetime perfecting his public face, presenting a mask of benevolent wisdom, but privately, the loss of his son to the enemy cause was a wound that refused to heal. He tried to reason with William, using the same logic he applied to his scientific papers. But politics is not physics. The laws of emotion do not obey the laws of motion. The air baths could cleanse his skin, and the ledger of virtues could cleanse his conscience, but nothing could cleanse the bitterness of a family torn apart by civil war. It was the one experiment that had failed catastrophically. Now, as he prepared to leave London, the memory of that failure hardened him. He realized that the project of perfection was no longer a personal hobby. It was a national necessity. The colonies were like he had been at 17, ragged, unformed, full of potential, but lacking the discipline to survive against a great power. They needed the order he had struggled to master. They needed the industry he had practiced in his print shop. They needed the frugality he had preached in his almanac. He looked at the trunk where the velvet suit lay hidden. He was done with being the diplomat, the charmer, the cosmopolitan bridge builder who sought to reconcile the child America with the mother Britain. The mother had rejected the child, and the child had outgrown the house. He thought of his glass harmonica, of how the most beautiful sounds came from the tension of friction. He thought of the electricity, of how the spark only jumps when the charge is great enough. The calm of the ocean voyage lay ahead, weeks of silence in which to think, to write, to plan. He would sit on the deck, watching the Gulf Stream, a warm river in the ocean, that he was the first to map, and he would calculate the logistics of treason. He was returning to Philadelphia, not as the young boy with bread under his arms, but as a patriarch bringing fire. The project of self-improvement was finished. The project of nation-building was about to begin. The internal ledger was closed, and a new declaration was waiting to be written, one that would require not just ink, but blood. The wind was rising in the west, and for the first time in his life, Benjamin Franklin did not seek to shelter from it. He turned his face fully into the gale, ready to become the storm itself. The storm he sailed into was not the first he had courted. Long before the Atlantic winds battered the hull of his returning ship, Benjamin Franklin had learned to stand in the presence of terrifying power without flinching. To understand the revolutionary he was becoming, one had to look back to the moment he decided that the pursuit of wealth was merely a prelude to the pursuit of wonder. It began in the quiet of his 42nd year, a time when most men of his era were settling into the rigid habits of middle age, concerned only with the accumulation of coin. Franklin, however, had closed his ledgers. He had built his franchise of printing houses. He had distributed his almanacs to the hearths of the colonies, and he had secured a comfortable existence. To the shock of his partners and the bewilderment of his rivals, he retired. He did not retire to rest, but to work harder than he ever had before, not for profit but for the sheer intoxicating luxury of understanding how the world was made. He viewed this new chapter as a second life, a gift of time that he called leisure to study. It was in this period of intellectual liberation that the true eccentricities of his genius began to flower, rooted in a deep, personal discipline that often baffled his neighbors. In the pale blue light of the early Philadelphia mornings, long before the bustling market noises filled the street, Franklin could be found engaging in a ritual he swore was the secret to his robust health. He called it his air bath. He would sit entirely naked in his second-story chamber, the windows thrown wide open to the chill morning breeze. For 30 minutes, sometimes an hour, he would sit exposed to the elements, reading or writing, believing that the fresh, cold air was a tonic that cleansed the skin and sharpened the mind. There, in the quietude of his room, the cool draught circulating around his form, he looked not like a statesman, but like a monk of some forgotten order, seeking communion with the atmosphere itself. It was from this place of stillness that he turned his eyes upward. The sky had always been a realm of superstition, a place where angry gods hurled thunderbolts to punish the wicked. Franklin, with the curiosity of a child and the precision of a craftsman, suspected otherwise. He looked at the jagged scars of lightning that tore through the summer nights, and saw not divine wrath, but a fluid and elemental fire that flowed like water. He became obsessed with the nature of this invisible force. He filled his house with glass tubes and rubbing cloths, generating static charges that made his hair stand on end and caused small bells to ring. He threw electrical parties where he would kill a turkey with an electrical shock to tenderize the meat, once inadvertently shocking himself so severely he described the blow as a universal blow from head to foot, leaving him numb and trembling. Yet the pain only deepened his fascination. He sensed that the tiny sparks jumping from his knuckles were the same substance as the terrible bolts that incinerated barns and split oak trees. This intuition led him to the open fields on a stormy afternoon in June of 1752. The image of the older man and the kite has passed into legend, often stripped of its visceral danger. It was not a whimsical pastime. It was a confrontation with death. He stood under a shed to keep the silk ribbon dry, holding the hemp string that vanished into the dark, churning belly of a thunderhead. He waited. The rain began to fall, wetting the hemp, making it conductive. For a long time, nothing happened. Then he saw the loose fibers of the string rise up, standing erect as if suspended by an unseen hand. He moved his knuckle toward the iron key tied to the end of the line. A spark, bright and sharp, jumped with a distinct crack. He felt the jolt travel up his arm, a handshake with the heavens. He had drawn fire from the clouds and stored it in a Leyden jar, proving once and for all that the lightning was electricity, and more importantly, that it could be understood, channeled, and tamed. The invention of the lightning rod followed, a simple iron spike that could bleed the destructive power from the sky and guide it safely into the earth. It was a monumental act of protection, a way to shield the fragile homes of humanity from the caprice of the storm. He had tamed the sky, turning a terrifying mystery into a manageable science. But Franklin's mind was not content with merely managing nature. He wished to harmonize with it. His fascination with the invisible forces of the world extended to the realm of sound. He recalled the way a wet finger run around the rim of a wine glass produced a pure singing tone. Applying his mechanical ingenuity to this phenomenon, he created the glass harmonica. It was an instrument of haunting beauty, a series of graduated glass bowls nested on a horizontal spindle, rotated by a foot pedal. When touched with wet fingers, the spinning glass emitted a sound so ethereal, so piercingly sweet, that listeners often wept. It was the music of the spheres brought down to earth. Mozart and Beethoven would later compose for it, entranced by its celestial vibrations. For Franklin, it was another manifestation of friction and tension, the same forces that created the lightning, now harnessed to create melody. He would play it late at night, the strange wavering notes floating out of his window, mingling with the Philadelphia fog. a sonic testament to a mind that saw the universe as a grand machine capable of being tuned. Yet, as he mastered the currents of the air and the vibrations of the glass, a more volatile current awaited him. The currents of human nature and political power. The transition from the laboratory to the royal courts of Europe was gradual, driven by the same meritocratic instinct that had propelled him from the candle shop. He understood that men, like electricity, followed the path of least resistance, and that influence could be conducted. He had mastered the Ben Franklin effect, a psychological truth he discovered in the Pennsylvania Assembly. To win over a rival legislator who despised him, Franklin did not grovel or argue. Instead, he asked the man to lend him a rare and curious book. Flattered by the request, the rival obliged. When Franklin returned it with a note of thanks, the dynamic shifted. The man, having done Franklin a kindness, now viewed him with favor. Franklin realized that to make a friend, one should not do a favor, but rather ask for one, creating a bond of investment. He carried this wisdom to London, acting as the voice of the colonies. For years, he walks the fine line of the loyal subject, believing that the rift between Britain and America was merely a misunderstanding of mechanics, a machine that needed oiling. He wore the velvet suits of the court, dined with lords, and charmed the intellectual salons. But the friction was becoming too great for simple diplomacy. The turning point, the moment the lightning finally struck the man himself, came in the damp, vaulted chamber known as the Cockpit. It was 1774. Franklin had obtained and leaked private letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, which revealed a conspiracy to abridge colonial liberties. He had hoped to show that the hostility came from a few corrupt officials, not the crown itself. The gamble failed catastrophically. Summoned before the Privy Council in London, Franklin stood in the centre of the amphitheatre, known as the Cockpit, while the Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, unleashed a torrent of abuse that lasted for an hour. The room was packed with the elite at the British Empire, jeering and laughing as Franklin was called a thief, a liar, and an inciter of treason. He stood absolutely motionless. He did not speak. He did not defend himself. His face remained a mask of stone, betraying not a flicker of emotion. He wore a suit of spotted Manchester velvet, standing like a statue amidst the verbal assault. Inside, however, the loyal subject was being incinerated. The heat of their mockery forged something harder and colder in his chest. He realized then that there was no taming this sky. The British Empire was not a force to be guided safely into the ground. It was a storm to be weathered and, ultimately, rejected. When he walked out of the cockpit, silent and composed, he went home and took off the velvet suit, folding it away with a grim promise that he would not wear it again until he signed a peace treaty as a representative of a free and independent nation. This transformation exacted a terrible price, one that no lightning rod could deflect. The schism of the revolution did not just tear through the map, it tore through his heart. His son, William Franklin, was his pride. Benjamin had used his influence to secure William the royal governorship of New Jersey, the illegitimate son raised to the highest heights of legitimacy. They had stood together in the shed during the kite experiment. William had been the one to help him raise the silk into the storm. They were partners in science and ambition. But as the political clouds darkened, William remained steadfastly loyal to the king. He believed in the order of the empire, in the hierarchy that had given him his station. Benjamin pleaded with him, using every argument of logic and emotion. But William would not bend. The youngest son complex that drove Benjamin to reinvent the world clashed violently with William's desire to preserve his place within it. The break was absolute. The father who had once invented a flexible catheter to ease his brother's pain could find no instrument to heal the breach with his son. When the war eventually came, William would be arrested as a loyalist, imprisoned, and finally exiled, never to see his father's affection again. In his will, Benjamin would leave William almost nothing, citing that since his son had opposed him in the struggle for liberty, he should expect nothing from the estate that liberty had secured. It was a cold, final calculation, the ledger closing on their bloodline. Now, on the deck of the ship carrying him back to Philadelphia, Franklin felt the weight of these memories. He thought of the kite string vibrating in the wind, the tension between the earth and the sky. He was that string now, stretched taut between the past and the future, between the crown he was rejecting and the republic he was helping to conceive. The ocean rolls beneath him, the Gulf Stream carrying him westward with its warm, hidden current. He was 70 years old, an age when men usually prepared for the grave, yet he was preparing for a birth. The scientific experiments of his retirement seemed distant now, and yet entirely relevant. He had learned that invisible forces governed the visible world. He had learned that pressure builds until it must be released. He had learned that if you do not provide a path for the lightning, it will destroy the house. The colonies were the house, and the king's tyranny was the gathering charge. He had tried to build a lightning rod in London, and they had laughed at him. Now he would return to build something else. He watched the horizon, where the grey water met the grey sky. He adjusted his spectacles, the bifocals he had invented to see both the near and the far, and peered into the mist. The silence of the ocean was ending. The noise of the Congress, the shout of the militia, the scratch of the quill on parchment awaited him. He breathed in the salt air, filling his lungs, performing one last private air bath in the Cathedral of the Atlantic. The philosopher was gone. The conspirator remained. As the coast of America drew near, unseen but felt in the changing rhythm of the swells, Benjamin Franklin turned from the rail and went below decks to pack his papers. The time for observation was over. The experiment of America was about to begin. The rhythmic creak of the ship's timbers and the endless rolling hiss of the Atlantic were soothing sounds, yet as Benjamin Franklin smoothed his hand over the fabric of a coat he was carefully folding into his trunk, the peace of the ocean vanished. The garment was made of Manchester velvet, a deep spotted brown, soft to the touch but heavy with memory. As his fingers traced the nap of the cloth, the salty air of the ship's cabin seemed to thicken, replaced by the stifling, overheated atmosphere of a crowded chamber in London. The year was 1774, only a short time ago, in the grand scale of his long life, but it felt like a century had passed since that day in the room known as the Cockpit. He stood there in his memory, motionless, just as he had stood in reality. The Cockpit was an amphitheatre within the sprawling complex of Whitehall Palace, a place that had once been used by King Henry VIII to watch cocks fight and tear one another to pieces for sport. Now, it served as the meeting place for the Privy Council, the king's inner circle of power, and on that damp grey Saturday in January, the sport was to be the public destruction of Dr. Franklin. The room was packed beyond capacity. 35 members of the Privy Council sat at the long table, their faces partially obscured by the shadows of the high, vaulted ceiling and the flickering light of the chandeliers. Behind them, pressing against the barriers, was a throng of spectators, dukes, earls, members of Parliament, and curious intellectuals, all squeezing together, shoulder to shoulder, to witness the humiliation of the famous American Prometheus. The air was close and smelled of unwashed wool, expensive hair powder, and the nervous perspiration of a crowd anticipating blood. Franklin stood at the end of the room, alone. He wore the very suit of spotted Manchester velvet that now lay folded in his trunk. He had chosen it for its elegance, but also for its simplicity, a contrast to the gilded pomp of the British aristocracy surrounding him. He did not lean against the mantelpiece. He did not fidget with his spectacles. He did not shift his weight from foot to foot. He made of himself a statue, a figure of stone carved in the likeness of a man, his face composed into a mask of absolute, impenetrable serenity. Facing him was Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General. Wedderburn was a man of sharp ambition and even sharper tongue, possessed of a voice that could slice through the murmur of a crowd like a whip. He had been tasked with the assault, and he relished the theatricality of the moment. The issue at hand was the affair of the Hutchinson letters, a controversy that had begun with Franklin's desperate attempt to preserve peace between the colonies and the mother country. Franklin's mind, sharp and analytical even under siege, replayed the events that had led him to this precipice. He had obtained private letters written by Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, in which the governor had urged Parliament to abridge the liberties of the colonists. Franklin, believing that the king and Parliament were merely misinformed by bad advisers like Hutchinson, had quietly sent the letters to patriots in Boston. His logic had been sound, or so he had thought. If the colonists saw that the tyranny originated from their own governor and not from the benevolent King George, their anger would be directed at Hutchinson, and the bond with Britain could be saved. It was a gamble based on the premise of the king's goodness, a premise that was now crumbling before his eyes. The letters had been published, the scandal had erupted, and the wrath of the Empire had turned not upon Hutchinson for his treachery to the people, but upon Franklin for exposing it. Wedderburn slammed his hand onto the table, the sound echoing off the stone walls. He accused Franklin not of politics, but of theft. He wove a narrative of a man who had insinuated himself into the trust of gentlemen only to steal their private correspondence. With a sneer that twisted his features, Wedderburn turned to the Privy Council and pointed a trembling finger at the silent philosopher. He called Franklin a man of 3 letters, a classical allusion to the Latin word thur, meaning thief. The insults rained down for an hour. It was a torrential storm of verbal abuse, unparalleled in the history of the council. Wedderburn mocked Franklin's scientific achievements, suggesting that he wanted to become the minister of a new revolution, creating an incendiary government, just as he had tinkered with sparks in his laboratory. The Solicitor General's voice rose and fell, dramatic and biting, drawing laughter and jeers from the aristocratic crowd. They laughed at the soap boiler's sum. They laughed at the man who had tamed the lightning, but could not tame the crown. Throughout the entire barrage, Franklin did not move. He did not utter a single word. His face remained fixed in that same pleasant, slightly listening expression, as if he were observing a curious natural phenomenon rather than his own political execution. He was practicing the virtue he had struggled with most in his youth, humility. But this was not the humility of submission. It was the humility of the mountain weathering the wind. He realized, as the invective washed over him, that he was no longer a British subject in spirit. The cords of affection that had bound him to England, the love of its literature, its cities, its history, were snapping one by one with every cruel word Wedderburn spoke. He had spent years trying to explain America to London, trying to be the bridge across the Atlantic. He had argued that the colonies were children of the Empire, deserving of the same rights as those born on English soil. He had believed in the unity of the English-speaking peoples. But as he looked into the faces of the Privy Councillors, men he had once dined with, men he had considered peers in the Republic of Letters, he saw only contempt. They did not see a fellow Briton. They saw a rebellious provincial, a subject to be disciplined, a problem to be solved. The psychological weight of the moment was immense. Franklin felt the ghost of his younger self standing beside him. The runaway apprentice who had arrived in Philadelphia with nothing, the ambitious printer who had built a fortune on industry and wit. That younger self would have fought back, would have unleashed a biting satire or a clever retort. But the elder Franklin, the sage of 68 years, understood that words were useless here. This was not a debate, it was a rejection. The Empire was cutting him off, and in doing so, they were cutting off America. He thought of his son, William. The pain of that thought was sharper than Wedderburn's rhetoric. William was the royal governor of New Jersey, a man who owed his position to the very crown that was now mocking his father. William had chosen the king over his own blood. The schism in the Cockpit was mirrored by the schism in Franklin's own heart. He realized that the coming conflict would not just divide nations, it would tear families apart. The 10th son was alone again, just as he had been when he walked Market Street with his bread rolls, but this time the solitude was profound and irreversible. Finally, the tirade ended. Wedderburn, flushed and triumphant, sat down to thunderous applause. The council voted to dismiss the petition Franklin had brought. They stripped him of his position as Deputy Postmaster General. They intended to leave him broken, humiliated, a pariah in the society he had come to love. Franklin turned. He did not bow. He did not acknowledge the jeers. He simply walked out of the chamber, moving with a slow, deliberate gait through the parting crowd. He walked out of the cockpit, out of Whitehall, and into the damp, cool air of the London night. The silence of the street was a balm after the cacophony of the trial. He returned to his lodgings, and there, in the quiet of his room, he took off the suit of Manchester velvet. He did not burn it. He did not throw it away. He folded it carefully, smoothing the creases with the same deliberate hands that had built the glass harmonica and the lightning rod. He whispered a promise to the empty room, a vow that was more powerful for its quietness. He would wear this coat one more time. He would not wear it to be abused by lords and solicitors. He would wear it when he signed the treaty that acknowledged the independence of the United States of America. He would wear it when the king who had laughed at him was forced to bow to the nation he had helped create. The memory dissolved, fading back into the reality of the ship's cabin. Franklin looked down at the trunk. The suit was packed. The vow was still active. The humiliation of the Cockpit had burned away the last remnants of his indecision. He was done with being a mediator. The lightning rod had taken the strike, and the house still stood, but the structure was changed. He closed the lid of the trunk and latched it. The ship groaned as it crested a wave, tilting the floor beneath his feet. He moved to the small porthole, looking out once more at the endless grey water. The transition from loyalist to revolutionary was complete. It had not happened on a battlefield with muskets and cannons, but in a velvet coat standing silent in a room full of shouting men. He had learned that day that reason could not persuade those who ruled by force. If the king wanted a storm, then Franklin, the master of storms, would help ensure he got one. He thought of the work ahead in Philadelphia. The Congress was gathering a chaotic assembly of lawyers, farmers, and merchants, all frightened, all angry, all looking for guidance. They would need money. They would need alliances with France. They would need gunpowder. But more than that, they would need a vision of what they were fighting for. They needed to understand that they were not just fighting against taxes on tea or stamps on paper. They were fighting for the dignity that had been denied to him in the cockpit. They were fighting for the right to stand up and not be laughed at. Franklin turned away from the window and sat at his small writing desk. The motion of the ship made the ink in the well sway gently. He dipped his quill. He was an old man now, nearing 70, an age when most men sought the comfort of the hearth and the company of grandchildren. But he had no time for rest. His air bath regimen had kept his body surprisingly resilient, and his mind was as clear as the glass of his spectacles. He began to write not a letter of apology to London, but notes for the organization of a new government. The ocean carried him closer to the shore with every passing hour. He was returning to a city he had physically built, paving its streets, lighting its lamps, organizing its fire brigades, but now he had to build something far more abstract and far more enduring. The humiliation of the cockpit had clarified the stakes. It was no longer about reform, it was about reinvention. As the quill scratched against the parchment, merging with the sounds of the creaking hull and the wind in the rigging, Benjamin Franklin felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. The anger of that day in London had cooled into a hard, diamond-like resolve. He was bringing home the fire he had stolen from the heavens, and the fire he had caught from the hatred of the Privy Council. He would use both to forge a republic. The candle in the cabin burned low, casting long, dancing shadows against the wooden walls. The ship sailed on through the dark, vast Atlantic, a tiny speck of wood and canvas, carrying the architect of a new world. The past was packed away in the trunk. The future lay somewhere beyond the dark horizon, waiting for the sun to rise over the Delaware River. With a steady hand, he finished his note, blew on the ink to dry it, and prepared to extinguish the light, ready to rest before the final approach to the city of brotherly love. The wick smouldered and died, sending a thin ribbon of grey smoke curling up toward the wooden beams of the cabin ceiling, vanishing into the damp air of the hold. The darkness that followed was absolute, save for the rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers, a lullaby of oak and iron that had cradled Benjamin Franklin across the violent expanse of the Atlantic. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen to the changing song of the water against the hull. The deep, rolling bass of the open ocean had shifted to the choppier, more urgent rhythm of the river current. They were no longer fighting the sea. They were riding the Delaware. The motion of the floor beneath his feet steadied, and the sounds of the crew on the deck above became hushed and purposeful. The long voyage was over. The Philadelphia skyline, familiar yet changed, awaited him in the morning mist. When Franklin stepped onto the wharf, the air tasted of pine tar, curing tobacco, and the impending storm of rebellion. He was home. Yet the city had built, the city of paved streets, fire brigades, and lending libraries, felt different. The cobblestones rang with a harder, more brittle sound under the wheels of carts. The conversations in the coffee houses had shifted from trade and philosophy to grievances and muskets. He walked these streets not merely as the printer or the postmaster, but as a man carrying the heavy, invisible burden of a continent's future. He was nearing 70 years of age, a time when most men sought the comfort of the hearth and the solace of memories, but Franklin was preparing to shed his old skin once more. The greatest sorrow of this return, however, was not the looming war, but the silence that grew in the space between a father and his son. William Franklin, the boy who had once held the kite string in the thunderstorm, standing shoulder to shoulder with his father as they captured lightning in a jar, was now a man of title and velvet. William was the royal governor of New Jersey, a staunch loyalist to the crown that had just humiliated his father in the cockpit. The meeting between them was stiff, laden with words unsaid. They sat in a parlour that felt too small for the magnitude of their disagreement. Ben looked at William and saw the tragic arc of his own ambition reflected back at him. He, the youngest son of a youngest son, who had arrived in this city eating a penny roll with dust on his coat, had raised William to be a gentleman. He had succeeded too well. William was a creature of the hierarchy, unable to imagine a world without a king, while Ben, the self-made man, could imagine nothing else. The rift cracked open, a fissure that would never heal, separating the past from the future. When they parted, they were no longer father and son, but enemies in a civil war of the heart. The days that followed blurred into a fever of quills and parchment. The Continental Congress was a cauldron of voices, but Franklin sat amidst them as a stabilizing anchor, his silence often louder than their shouting. He signed the declaration with a steady hand, knowing that the ink was a death warrant if they failed. But he knew, with the pragmatic calculation of a tradesman, that declarations alone could not stop cannonballs. They needed gunpowder. They needed gold. They needed the might of a navy. They needed France. And so, late in the year of 1776, as the winter winds began to whip the grey Atlantic into a frenzy, the old man boarded another ship. It was a suicide mission in all but name. British cruisers patrolled the coast, their captains holding orders to hang the arch-traitor Franklin from the yardarm if captured. He was old, plagued by gout and aching joints, yet he took to the sea with the calm of a man who viewed the world as a laboratory. Even as the ship, the Reprisal, pitched in the freezing swells, he dipped his thermometer into the water, mapping the warmth of the Gulf Stream, turning the danger of the crossing into data. When he finally landed on the coast of Brittany, battered by the voyage but unbroken, he did not arrive as a beggar. He arrived as an invention. He understood, perhaps better than any man alive, the power of image. He knew what the French expected of him. To the glittering court of Versailles, weary of its own decadence, America was a dream of rustic purity, a land of noble savages and Roman virtues. Franklin decided to become that dream. He cast aside the powdered wigs that were de rigueur for gentlemen of his station. He left his velvet coats in the trunk. Instead, he dressed in the plain, brown-spun cloth of a Quaker, though he was not one. He wore his own thinning grey hair, long and unadorned, flowing over his collar, and upon his head he placed a cap of marten fur, a rough, frontier accessory that suggested a man who had just walked out of the American wilderness. To complete the persona, he wore his spectacles constantly, peering over the rims with a look of benevolent ancient wisdom. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Paris did not just welcome him, it fell in love. As he travelled from the coast to the capital, crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the famous doctor, the tamer of lightning, the philosopher of the woods. When he established his residence in the quiet village of Passy, just outside the bustle of Paris, the Hôtel de Valentinois became the centre of the diplomatic universe. He was the Magician of Passy. Life in Passy settled into a rhythm that was equal parts statecraft and performance art. He knew that the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, was a man of cold calculation who would not be moved by pleas for charity. He had to be seduced. Franklin employed the psychological insight he had honed over a lifetime. The best way to win a man is not to argue with him, but to charm him, to make him believe that helping you is his own idea. Franklin's mornings began with a ritual that baffled the French servants, but delighted his own sense of natural order. He would wake early, open the tall windows of his chamber to the crisp morning air, and sit entirely naked for an hour, writing or reading. He called this his air bath, believing that the skin needed to breathe just as the lungs did, and that the shock of the cool air hardened the constitution against illness. There he sat, the most famous man in the world, a fleshy, calm figure bathed in the pale light of the French dawn, composing letters that would reshape empires, clad only in the atmosphere. By afternoon, the magician was at work in the salons. He did not press for money with desperate urgency. Instead, he played chess. He sat for hours at the board, surrounded by the powdered ladies and perfumed dukes of the court, moving his pieces with slow, deliberate contemplation. He used the game as a metaphor, publishing an essay on the morals of chess, teaching that foresight, circumspection, and caution were the keys to victory, a subtle message to the French king that aiding America was a move of grand strategy, not mere charity. He brought with him the sounds of the future as well. In the evenings, when the candles were lit and the wine flowed, Franklin would unveil his most ethereal invention, the glass harmonica, a series of glass bowls, graduated in size and nested on a horizontal spindle spun by a foot pedal. He would wet his fingers with water and touch the rims of the spinning glass. The sound that emerged was unlike anything the court had ever heard her singing. Ghostly resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a high, pure vibration that made the air itself tremble. Listeners wept openly. They said it was the music of the spheres, the voice of angels. Mozart would later write for it. But in those salons, it was Franklin's voice, hypnotic and otherworldly, binding the emotional landscape of the French aristocracy to his will. He became a fashion icon. The coiffure à la Franklin, hair dressed to look like his receding mane, became the rage. His face appeared on snuff boxes, rings and medallions. He joked in a letter to his daughter that his face was as well known in France as the man in the moon. But behind the celebrity, behind the fur cap and the soft music, the steel trap of his mind remained set. He was spying on the spies. He knew he was surrounded by British agents, so he hid nothing, operating with a transparency that confused them. He knew that if he tried to hide his secrets, they would be found, so he let his daily life be the performance, leaving the true negotiations for the quiet whispers in the corners of the garden. Yet the magic required energy, and the old man was tired. The ache of the separation from William never truly left him. While he charmed the Comtesse de Détourdeau or flirted with Madame Helvetius, a part of him remained in that small parlour in Philadelphia, staring across the divide at his son. He compensated for the loss of his biological family by creating a surrogate one in France. He became Bonhomme Richard to the French, a kindly grandfatherly sage who offered simple wisdoms. He navigated the treacherous waters of court politics with the same intuition he had used to navigate the Gulf Stream. He applied the Ben Franklin effect with masterful precision. He would ask small favors of his enemies, borrowing a rare book from a skeptic's library, knowing that the act of granting the favor would cognitively force the lender to view him more favorably. He wove a web of obligation and affection, strand by strand, until the French monarchy, the oldest and most absolute in Europe, found itself inextricably tied to a group of Republican rebels in the New World. The winter of 1777 brought news that tested his resolve. Philadelphia had fallen to the British, the Congress was in flight, his home was occupied, the American cause hung by a thread, freezing in the snows of Valley Forge. The French court wavered. Why back a losing horse? The Magician of Passy had to pull his greatest trick yet. He did not panic. He did not beg. When asked about the fall of Philadelphia, he smiled calmly, adjusted his spectacles and said, "No, monsieur. It is not that Howe has taken Philadelphia. It is that Philadelphia has taken Howe." He framed the defeat as a strategic trap, projecting an air of inevitability about American victory that he did not truly feel. And then the wind changed. Word arrived of the Battle of Saratoga, a stunning, impossible victory where a British army had surrendered to the ragtag Americans. Franklin seized the moment. He took the raw energy of that news and amplified it through the salons, the press, and the whispered corridors of Versailles. He presented the victory not as a lucky stroke, but as proof of destiny. The time for seduction was over. The time for commitment had arrived. In early 1778, the work of the magician culminated in a quiet room far from the crowds. There, with the stroke of a pen, the Treaty of Alliance was signed. France would send money, troops, and ships. The colonies were no longer fighting alone. Franklin had done what no army could do. He had brought a superpower to its knees, not in surrender, but in friendship. He walked out into the gardens of Passy that evening, the weight of the parchment lifting slightly from his shoulders. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and clipped hedges. He looked up at the moon, the same moon that shone over the occupied streets of Philadelphia and the dark cell where his son William now sat as a prisoner of the Patriots. The victory was sweet, but it was seasoned with the bitterness of sacrifice. He adjusted his fur cap, feeling the chill of the evening, and turned his gaze back toward the house where the glass harmonica waited, silent and still. The music of the revolution was reaching its crescendo, but the conductor knew that the final movement had yet to be played. The silence of the French garden was not merely an absence of sound, but a heavy, velvet curtain that seemed to separate the aging diplomat from the world he had so fundamentally altered. The moon, which had witnessed his anxious nights and his secret gambits, now shone upon a different man. The years in Passy had etched deep lines into his face, a map of the worries and the wit that had charmed a kingdom. The war had drifted on, a distant thunder rolling across the Atlantic, but here, amidst the clipped hedges and the scent of lavender, the final strokes of the grand design were being applied. Time moved with the slow, deliberate pace of the Seine. The victory at Yorktown had come and gone, a herald of the inevitable, yet the peace required a craftsman's touch. It was not until the year 1783 that the final seal was pressed into the hot wax of the Treaty of Paris. The British Empire, the colossal force that had once defined Benjamin's very identity, formally recognized the sovereignty of the United States. He held the parchment in hands that now trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the accumulation of 77 winters. It was done. The impossible experiment had survived the crucible. Yet as he prepared to leave the embrace of France, a land that had revered him as a sage and a sorcerer of science, a shadow lingered over his triumph. It was the shadow of a son, William Franklin, once the bright promise of Benjamin's lineage. The boy who had flown the kite with him in the thunderstorms of yesterday was now a stranger in exile. The revolution that had birthed a nation had severed a family. William, the steadfast loyalist, remained broken and banished, a prisoner of his own allegiance. There was a final cold meeting in England before Benjamin turned his face toward the west. It was a brief intersection of two lives that had drifted to opposite poles of history. Words were exchanged, but the warmth was gone, replaced by the polite rigidity of strangers. In the ledger of his life, where Benjamin balanced his moral virtues and his debts, the loss of his son was a deficit that no amount of diplomacy could reconcile. When he later drafted his will, the pain would manifest in the stroke of bitter ink. He would leave William almost nothing, save for some worthless, boggy lands in Nova Scotia, noting with a stinging finality that if Britain had not compensated the Loyalists, certainly he, a patriot, would not do so. The ocean voyage home in 1785 was a long exhale. The London packet creaked and groaned, a cradle rocking the old man between two worlds. He was no longer the runaway apprentice eating rolls on Market Street, nor the ambitious printer seeking a fortune. He was a celebrated icon. Yet his body was failing. The stone in his bladder was a constant, sharp companion, a reminder of mortality that arrived with every jolt of the carriage or roll of the ship. But his mind, that restless churning engine, refused to dim. He spent the voyage measuring the temperature of the ocean, mapping the mysterious warm river within the sea known as the Gulf Stream, turning the very water that carried him into a subject of study. Philadelphia rose from the mist, a city transformed yet familiar. The bells rang out, a chaotic, joyous clamour that reached him before his foot touched the dock. Cannon fire boomed in salute. He was carried, quite literally, into the embrace of the city he had built. Because the pain of walking was too great, he eventually took to travelling in a sedan chair, a glass-windowed box carried by prisoners from the Walnut Street jail, bobbing above the cobblestones like a relic of a bygone era. But retirement was a luxury the newborn nation would not grant him. The Articles of Confederation were crumbling, the loose knot of states threatening to unravel into anarchy. And so, in the sweltering summer of 1787, the 81-year-old sage was summoned once more. He was carried to the Pennsylvania State House, the very building where independence had been declared, to serve as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. The air inside the hall was thick and stifling. To ensure secrecy, the windows were nailed shut, trapping the heat of the Philadelphia summer, along with the heated tempers of the delegates. Flies buzzed against the glass, desperate to escape, while men half Benjamin's age argued over the soul of the Republic. He sat quietly for long hours, his eyes half closed, appearing to doze, though he missed nothing. He was the ballast in a ship rocking violently in a storm. When the debates turned venomous, when the small states threatened to walk out and the large states refused to yield, it was Franklin who sought to lower the temperature. He offered the wisdom of the youngest son, the pragmatism of the tradesman. He knew that perfection was the enemy of the good. He saw that they were not building a monument to the gods, but a shelter for flawed men. "I agree to this constitution with all its faults," he would later declare, "if they are such." During those long, humid days, Benjamin's gaze often drifted to the presiding officer's chair, occupied by George Washington. It was a high-backed wooden chair, carved with a decorative sunburst at the crest. The paint and gilt were faded, the design ambiguous. Throughout the months of deadlock, Benjamin had studied that sun, wondering about its nature. Was it a sun climbing the horizon, bringing the light of a new day? Or was it a sun dipping below the edge of the world, signalling the onset of a long dark night for the experiment of democracy? On the final day, as the delegates moved forward one by one to affix their names to the parchment that would define the future, the answer came to him. The fatigue lifted for a moment, replaced by a clarity that felt like the cool air of his morning baths. He watched the ink dry on the page, the signatures forming a chain of commitment. He leaned over to a colleague and spoke his mind, his voice soft but resonant in the hushed room. He gestured toward the chair. "I have often in the course of the session," he whispered, "looked at that behind the president, without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." The sun had risen, but Benjamin's own light was beginning to fade into the twilight. His final years were spent in the quiet sanctuary of his home on Market Street, surrounded by his grandchildren. The pain in his body grew more insistent, confining him to his bed for weeks at a time. Yet, he found ways to cheat the suffering. He imported opium to dull the sharp edges of the stone, and he found solace in the ethereal spinning music of his glass harmonica. In the evenings, the strange high-pitched hum of the glass bowls would drift through the house, a sound so pure it seemed to belong to the spheres of heaven rather than the earth. Even in these twilight hours, the fire of his moral evolution continued to burn. The man who had once owned slaves, who had carried the prejudices of his century, now looked at the institution of slavery with horror. He realized that the liberty he had spent his life crafting was incomplete if it did not extend to all men. In his 84th year, as his final public act, he became the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He took up his pen one last time, not for a treaty or an almanac, but for a petition to Congress. With the same sharp wit that had birthed Silence Dogood, he urged the removal of this inconsistency from the character of the American people. He argued that they must step to the very verge of the power vested in them to discourage every species of traffic in the bodies of their fellow men. It was a radical, thundering closing argument from a man who could barely lift his head from the pillow. The end came in April of 1790. A fever seized him, and the fluid in his lungs made every breath a labour. His daughter Sally sat by his side, watching the chest that had held the breath of a century rise and fall with agonizing slowness. When she tried to adjust his position to make him more comfortable, implying he might recover, he looked at her with a gentle, tired smile. "A dying man can do nothing easy," he whispered. It was a final observation, a last data point in the study of existence. The laboratory was closing down, the kite was grounded, the printing press silent, the electrical jars discharged. The polymath who had tried to drink the ocean of knowledge dry was finally putting down the cup. He had lived enough for 10 men. He had been a candlemaker's son, a runaway, a printer, a scientist, a diplomat, and a revolutionary. He had plucked the lightning from the sky and the scepter from the tyrants. As the hours wore on, the room grew still. The bustling sounds of Philadelphia, the city that was the mirror of his soul, faded into a distant hum. He closed his eyes, and perhaps, in that final drift toward the dark, he saw not the statesmen or the kings, but the simple, crisp image of a young boy walking down a street with 3 rolls, eyes wide with the infinite possibility of the morning. The sun that he had declared to be rising would now climb the sky without him, casting its light on a nation he had willed into being. His own sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in the soft, quiet purples of dusk. The work was finished. The book was printed. The epitaph he had written for himself years ago, comparing his body to the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, promised that he would appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author. But for now, the press stopped. The ink dried. The great mind, finally, found its rest. The silence returned to the room, deep and absolute, a peace that required no treaty. Good night.